Hi, I'm Erik Voss, and this is a breakdown of The Walking Dead Season 7, Episode 11, Hostiles and Calamities. And yeah, we're back on the blue screen here at New Rockstars, so I feel like I'm kinda on the set of The Walking Dead. Anyway, this episode just goes to show you that episodes that center on side characters can be pretty fun, so long as it's a sympathetic character finally breaking bad by playing Atari and doing lots of science stuff.
Yes, science!
So I'm gonna explain everything that you might have missed, some Easter eggs and changes from the comics, so let's get started with the opening images. So this episode begins with a close-up on this sandwich. It's the same sandwich that Fat Joey was eating right before Daryl bludgeoned him back in episode 8. And I like how this shot frames the sandwich, with its tomatoes spilling out to parallel Fat Joey in the background with his tomato brains spilling out. But also, I think the sandwich is meant to remind us of the sandwich in the opening images of another Sanctuary-based episode this season, episode 3, and that sandwich reflected Dwight's domestic routine in the Sanctuary, which he used to distract himself from the fact that he was really more of a prisoner there. And seeing this sandwich splattered on the ground suggests that Dwight's facade is beginning to fall apart. And notice how the editing of these opening scenes places Dwight and Eugene side by side for comparison. They're two valued Sanctuary residents bracing for the worst, but Eugene instead gets luxury treatment. Meanwhile, a beating in a prison cell is exactly what happens to Dwight. So really, this episode starts with Dwight and Eugene in opposite circumstances in the Savior power structure, but by making similar choices, they arrive at the same place. I'll come back to this. Now, this Savior, named Laura, calls Eugene haircut, and that is a callback to episode 8, when Eugene awkwardly stared as Laura flirted with Spencer.
You like watching haircut?
Yes.
So, in a way, this is Laura flirting with Eugene now, reminding him that she remembers what gets him off.
He's watching again. Over there.
And considering that we've seen Laura flirt with Spencer, and then with Dwight at the beginning of episode 3, I feel like that might be part of her job for Negan. Try to seduce these weak men to make them feel more at home at the Sanctuary. And then notice the author that Eugene name drops here.
Vonda in McIntyre, this would be satisfactory.
So Vonda N. McIntyre is a science fiction author who has written a ton of books, including several Star Trek novels. And I think this sets up an important sci-fi motif for this episode. Eugene feels like an alien in an unfamiliar planet. And like many sci-fi heroes, he has to use his wits and strategic thinking to survive. Or at least that might be how Eugene sees it. Also, notice how Eugene turns on the stereo to play everyone's favorite torture song.
We're on an easy street, and it feels so sweet.
But rather than immediately turning it off like any sane person would, Eugene bobs his head along to the music. And I think this is an important distinction from Daryl's time in the Sanctuary. For Daryl, this song was torture, an ironic taunt of how dire his imprisonment was. And his rebellious response showed that he would never kneel to Negan. Meanwhile, Eugene embracing the song indicates that he's totally willing to play ball. And then right before the opening credits, notice how Dwight stuffs this "go now" note into his pocket right before Negan and the other Saviors jump him. This little detail shows that Dwight still wants to protect Sherry's involvement with Daryl's escape, even though he doesn't yet understand why she did it or why she would take off and throw him under the bus like that. That's love, guys. Totally pathetic, self-disrespecting love. Okay, moving on to Dwight in the prison cell. Now this is the same cell that Dwight imprisoned Daryl in. And notice what Negan says.
Is it just as cozy as you remember?
So that means Dwight occupied this specific cell both before and after Daryl did. In many ways, he never really left it. So again, we're seeing some more parallelism between the two Ds, which makes Negan's later line so important.
Daryl isn't like you. He's emotional.
So Negan's wrong here. Dwight is actually very emotional. He's just better at hiding his true loyalties from Negan. And Negan's blind spot for the actual similarities between Dwight and Daryl looks like it's being set up as a key weakness. Okay, so then we get this interaction between Dwight and Dr. Carson. And other than painting Carson as this kind of antagonistic figure who talks shit about Sherry in front of a guy who's still very much in love with her, I like how this scene foreshadows what eventually happens to Carson with this little joke when Dwight grabs a bunch of suckers as if to say, yeah, sorry bro, but you're a sucker. And then back in his room, Dwight notices that his fish is upside down, and in its mouth he finds this pack of cigarettes that Sherry left behind for him. You see, that's her lipstick there. And if you look closely, those are Morley brand cigarettes. So Morley cigarettes have shown up throughout the series, and in a ton of movies and shows, they're a fictional version of Marley's, Marlboros. Really, Morleys were popularized on the X-Files, which seems to be what The Walking Dead is referencing anytime we see these. And before I move on, as Dwight takes off on the motorcycle, we get this shot of his reflection in the puddle of of Fat Joey's blood. This reflects his guilt in this moment. By losing Sherry, who in turn let Daryl escape, Fat Joey's blood is partially on Dwight's hands. Okay, moving on to Eugene's tour of the sanctuary, where Laura finally gives us some answers on how their social order really works. Beneath the upper class of saviors, people are numbered based on what service they provide, with exchanges based on a point system. So they mentioned number 42 before, he makes potato chips, and then we saw number 39 back in episode 3. He was the red-haired guy who fought over rations. And this long-haired redhead kid whom Eugene sees steal something is that man's son. Remember, Dwight looted their bunk afterwards. So the reason we're seeing him stealing now is that now that his dad is a walker chained up in the yard, his family is left with no means to provide for themselves. Poor kid can't even afford a haircut. So what's your excuse, Carl? And this jar of pickles was probably brined from the cucumbers that we saw in the truck from the hilltop in episode 7. So Eugene is feasting on the spoils from the plundering of crops grown by his friends. Always know where your food comes from, guys. And moving on to this interesting scene outside with Negan. Notice how quickly Eugene returns to his lie that he worked on the Human Genome Project and has multiple advanced degrees. That's what Eugene did to trick Abraham and Rosita, and later Rick and all the others, into keeping him safe. If it worked on them, why shouldn't it work on Negan? Now, we learned back in season 5 when Eugene told everyone the truth that this lie is core to his character.
I know I'm smarter than most people. I know I'm a very good liar, and I know I needed to get to DC.
This is what he does. Use the trivia and big words that he does know into posing as an all-around world-class expert. And seeing him return to this old trick tells us that Eugene seems to be starting over with the Saviors. And he's betting that his old friends won't be around long enough to rat him out. Or, an alternate theory, this act could be just an act, and he's still on Team Rick, but I'll talk more about that later. Now, you may be wondering, why is Eugene being treated so well by the Saviors, whereas Daryl was treated like abusive pet owners treat a stray dog? I think this shows that Negan understands that different prisoners require different incentives. Like when Daryl took a swing at him, Negan knew that this guy was an animal and he tried to break him in like one. Meanwhile, Eugene is physically weaker, more of an intellectual, so Negan knows that with a little honey, he'll catch this fly pretty quickly. And even though this works almost immediately on Eugene, I like how this scene depicts the difficult crossroads that he's at by having him cling for dear life to this jar of pickles. He's literally in a pickle in this moment. Betray my friends or bring myself a ton of pain? Betrayal sounds good. And then when Eugene suggests using liquid metal to reinforce the structural integrity of these walkers, he mentions the title of this episode.
Bonus points for covering their head and protecting them from head trauma from hostiles and calamities.
Now, when Eugene says hostiles and calamities, he's referring to the two primary types of threats facing the survivors of this world. Hostiles refer to human enemies who mean them harm. Meanwhile, calamities are natural dangers that come at random, in other words, walkers. And these are the two things threatening Eugene in this moment: the hostile saviors surrounding him and the calamitous walkers on the other side of the fence. And his solution is his desperate attempt to keep both of these threats at bay. And really, Eugene's general fear of hostiles and calamities is what motivates all of his actions this episode. And in case you missed it, this liquid metal idea is something Eugene picked up back in episode 14 of last season when he and Abraham ran into that metal skull walker in the armory and he struggled to take it down. And before I move on, I love this subtle moment between Negan and Eugene.
There is nothing like beautiful women that smell good to make you feel human again.
I wouldn't know anything about that.
Yeah, Eugene, you wouldn't know anything about being human. Okay, moving on to Eugene's nerdy, not at all sexual date night with Negan's wives, Tanya, Frankie, and Amber. You may remember Amber from episode 7 as the woman who slept with Mark, who got marked, which is why she's drinking herself stupid out of guilt this episode. And the video game that Eugene's playing here is called Yar's Revenge. It's an Atari 2600 game from 1982. Yar is an alien insect thing who battles his way through a wall in order to kill the evil Quotile, which is how they pronounce it later. I always thought it was Kotal, but whatever. And much like that Yonda and McIntyre shout out earlier, I feel like this is another nerdy sci-fi reference that might apply to Eugene. Like, Eugene might also see himself as an insect-like alien trying to wear down this barrier of trust with the saviors to defeat the evil monster from within. Now, Eugene's homemade science project fireworks display is based on actual science. The foam explosion is a real thing that you might have seen online using hydrogen peroxide, dish soap, and a catalyst like sodium iodide. And the hydrogen gas in the latex glove balloons is actually super flammable. It's what caused the Hindenburg to explode. And according to Josh McDermott, on one of the takes, the candle only punctured a small hole in the balloon, sending it flying around, spitting fire. And I'm kind of mad at the show for not using that take. But then notice what music Eugene is humming here. This is Tchaikovsky's 1812 overture, which you may know from another famous fireworks display in V for Vendetta. And that movie and comic series was all about overthrowing an authoritarian regime by resurrecting the famous gunpowder plot in England when Guy Fawkes conspired to blow up Parliament in 1605. So the fact that Eugene has this on his mind right now is pretty interesting. Granted, these chemical explosives aren't that powerful, and I don't know if Eugene could really construct real bombs to demolish a sanctuary, but it might mean that Eugene is plotting his own secret plan to overthrow Negan. I don't know, we'll see. All right, moving on to Dwight searching for Sherry in their old house, where Dwight confirms that Sherry was indeed the one who slipped Daryl the keys in the Go Now note. And he learns why she did it in this super heartbreaking letter. She felt Dwight had gone too far to the dark side, and Daryl would remind Dwight of the good man he used to be, which would just bring him pain. So she freed Daryl and took off, apparently not at all thinking what kind of shitty punishment this would bring to Dwight. But really, I think Sherry is misjudging Dwight here. Like Negan, she's assuming Dwight has shut off his emotions when he clearly hasn't. I mean, come on lady, he just brought you those pretzels and beer that you love, and just look at his face every time Negan kisses you. Okay, I get it, those scars are kind of hard to look at. Also, remember how last season there was some confusion over whether her name was Sherry or Honey? Now we know Honey was just Dwight's private nickname for her, but I like how the show turned that confusion into an actual plot point this episode, with Dwight later using the goodbye Honey part to frame Carson, because really anyone can call anyone Honey, even cranky old doctors. Okay, moving on to Eugene gathering painkillers to make a poison for Frankie and Tanya. And I alluded to this before, but I really think Eugene's transformation is modeled on another nerdy, pushed around scientist, Walter White in Breaking Bad, a character the people at AMC are obviously very familiar with. Before he became Heisenberg, Walter White faced his own hostiles and calamities, leading him to suddenly growing a backbone and finally getting what he wants.
Fuck you, Bogdan. I said fuck you! And your eyebrows!
Just like Eugene does here.
I'll report directly to Negan, which means you report directly to my ass.
I mean, let's face it, this line is probably the closest Eugene will get to I'm the one who knocks. And yeah, it's super satisfying to see a beat down loser feel empowerment like this, looting all the pills and grimply gunk the monkey. But if Eugene is truly getting drunk with power here, he might risk ending up the same way Walter White did. And in another Heisenberg parallel, we get this Breaking Bad style cook montage, using the powers of science to make a very lethal drug. And Eugene making this poison pill actually reminds me of the ricin storyline in Breaking Bad, and I would love it if the show ended up taking this turn. Also, the music that plays here is Everything Right Is Wrong Again by They Might Be Giants.
Everything right is wrong again, just like in a long, long trailer.
And the music applies pretty directly to Eugene's situation. Like everything that had been going right in his life, like gradually building trust and a way to contribute to his friends, has become wrong again. He's back to his old ways of lying his way into being valued. Okay, let's move on to this furnace scene. So how exactly did Dwight frame Dr. Carson? Well, he clipped out the goodbye honey part of Sherry's letter and left it in Carson's office, leading Negan to it, with Negan assuming Sherry left it for Carson after Carson freed Daryl to impress Sherry, and then Sherry escaped because she knew that she would be blamed. So this bullshit story, combined with Dwight claiming to have killed Sherry when he found her, effectively clears both her and Dwight, pinning everything on that meddling old Romeo. And I gotta say, that is a very complicated version of events that Dwight is very lucky Negan just accepted as truth. And it's pretty crazy that Negan would just trust Dwight so much, despite all the reasons Dwight would have to still hate him. That he would take his word over that of this doctor who presumably hasn't really ever been mistreated or personally motivated against Negan in any way. But again, I think that blind spot for Dwight is gonna end up being Negan's undoing. I also like how the camera stays focused on Dwight during this tense moment between Negan and Carson. Like Dwight won't look because he knows he pretty much sentenced this innocent man to die. Meanwhile, it's important that Eugene actually sees this. Well, he kinda does. He cowardly covers his face like he does anytime anyone gets killed. But it's crucial that Eugene be reminded exactly how evil Negan is so that his submission to him truly feels like he's selling his soul. Now, Dr. Carson's death is a big deal because this is a pretty significant deviation from the comics. Like in the comic storyline, Carson actually helps Eugene and the other prisoners escape from the sanctuary. But it looks like the show is going in a different direction, perhaps giving Eugene and Dwight a more active arc as they live under Negan. And then real quick, when Negan says this line,
"Good thing we got a spare Dr. Carson."
even though he's looking at Eugene in this moment, whom he thinks has a doctorate degree, I think Negan is actually talking about the other Dr. Carson, Dr. Harlan Carson, Carson, the doctor at the hilltop, brother to the guy in the furnace. That might mean Negan is on his way to the hilltop, which isn't good news for Maggie or Daryl, who said that's where he's headed next. Now, these next scenes from Eugene feel like true moral losses for him. Like he refuses to give the poison pill to the wives because they'll use it on Negan, and then he professes his loyalty to the big guy as if they're freaking soulmates.
I'm Negan. I'm utterly, completely, stone cold Negan. I was Negan before I even met you. I just needed to meet you properly to know.
Oh, that's so sweet. I'm sure next week we'll see Eugene taking that stereo and like say anything in Easy Street outside Negan's window. Now, seeing this cowardly betrayal is kind of hard to swallow, and I admit that it could be an act. Now, I will talk about that later, but for now, let's entertain the notion that Eugene might be just being honest here. Like, it kind of makes sense. Eugene admits that he's a coward and a man of logic. And when given the option to fight alongside an outmatched group who shits on him and doesn't really trust him, or assimilate into this new community with a simpler view of the world, where he's in the inner circle, in the world's top scientists, where they have pickles and an Atari. I totally get where Eugene is coming from. I would probably do the same thing. And that brings me to our closing images, with the most awkward reunion ever between Eugene and Dwight.
Regarding me clamping down on your...
So Eugene is trying to bring up the last time these guys interacted last season, when Eugene got quite the mouthful. And making this even more uncomfortable for Dwight, Eugene is slowly chomping down on a pickle. But let's listen closely to this final exchange between the two.
Regarding me clamping down on your... I am. Just like you. Eugene. You're Dwight. We're Negan.
So on the surface, this is meant to sound totally bleak, with these two men selling their souls and turning their backs on innocence to arrive at the same trapped place, utterly, completely on board with Negan. But when Eugene says, just like you, maybe he's not referring to the public perception of Dwight as a loyal savior, but rather Dwight's true self, an imposter playing an act and waiting for the right moment to make his move. Because when you think about it, both of these guys are smart enough to pull off this act. Maybe Eugene refused to use the poison pill because he's playing the long game. And maybe he cut off Negan before, not because he's eager to show his support, but because he wanted to perhaps delegitimize the question in a way. And by saying, I am Eugene, you are Dwight, we are Negan, Eugene might be using some coded language. Like, we are both still the independent men that we were before, but for now, we're gonna continue to act like we're with Negan. And we're gonna carefully pick our battles to stay ahead of any hostiles and calamities. Okay, looking ahead to next episode, episode 12, titled Say Yes, probably as a reference to Rick's deal with Jada's last episode to find guns.
Say yes.
Which will bring them to this freaky ass Walker carnival with some American Horror Story type freak show walkers. Seriously, it looks like this show was like, oh, right, zombies are in The Walking Dead, so let's do a spooky episode. And from the sound of Michonne's foreboding line in the sneak peek clip, dark things are waiting for them.
Something serious happened here.
Ooh, serious. And some lingering questions. 1, do you think Eugene really has gone to the dark side, or is it just an act? I feel like I've already laid out the two sides of this argument, just let me know what you think. And 2, was Sherry right about Dwight? Is there no hope for redemption for him? Or is he just bad at expressing himself, which works great for Negan, but bad for anyone else trying to root for the guy? Okay, let me know what you think in the comments, and check out my other breakdowns of season 7 episodes, and thanks for watching. And if you like this video, please hit like and subscribe to New Rockstars. Also, please share this video, and if you really like New Rockstars, you can contribute to us on Patreon. Thank you so much to all of our current patrons. You guys are awesome, especially you, Kelly Dunn. You can hit me up on Twitter at EA Voss with any thoughts or theories you have on The Walking Dead, or follow New Rockstars on Twitter at New Rockstars for updates on our videos. All right, thanks for watching. Bye.